Hello class, my name is Donna Riley. I'm an adjunct faculty at Stony Brook University. I'm an LCSW with R privilege in New York State and a PhD candidate at Stony Brook School of Social Welfare. Jennifer has asked me, Dr. Wood has asked me today to do a sort of video presentation, which is kind of new to me, so I'm used to doing one-on-one, but I'll do my best. She did submit a bunch of questions that you guys came together with, and most of them were pretty good, so I don't really see any I'm going to skip over. I don't like the answers, but I'm going to give them to you anyway. Okay, so first question I have here is, what was the most difficult time in transition? Actually, the most difficult time in transition was telling my wife. At that point, we'd been married about 18 years, and to come out to her as transgender is not really something she was really expecting to have happen, although she had some inkling prior to our marriage. But that was probably the most difficult time. We did go through couples counseling for about a year and a half, and really recognized that both of us had found our soulmates. So we dealt with it best we could, and we love each other, and just celebrated our 37th anniversary. So that was probably the most difficult time. How did you get the courage to open yourself up? I'm assuming you're talking about doing these workshops, because I'm going to be addressing some of the other issues later on. I believe, as a transgender woman and an activist for my community, that if we don't speak, it's the silence that it only continues the ignorance about my community. So, when I came out and transitioned, there really was no community established in my area, even though New York is a relatively progressive state. The reality is that there was a lesbian and gay community, but there was really no mention of the T. Now, this was 1997, so probably most of you don't remember the climate back then, but basically there was the T at the end of LBGT, but most organizations it was really more political than anything else. So opening up, actually telling my story, was an amazing sense of relief to me and self-validation, which actually talks to my research on transgender aging, that it seems to be one of the greatest facilitators of becoming healthy in aging and having what I talk of as a integrated social identity is presenting our experiences in public arenas, thus getting the validation of our transgender identity and building self-esteem and all that good nonsense that goes along with it. How did you cope with your feelings of being like different gender inside? I really didn't think there was much of an issue until I got actually into school. I guess it was kindergarten or first grade. When I quickly realized that, playing with dolls and stuff was not going to be acceptable. So I basically did like most of my study participants did, is I learned to pass as my natal sex. In other words, I looked around at boys and tried to mimic their behavior and act accordingly as to protect who I was inside. This way I wasn't called sissy, faggot, any of these things. I didn't experience a lot of real negative issues with that respect. So basically I would say, it was passing and isolation. I had very few friends. I was fearful that people would sort of get to see who I truly was, and obviously at that point not accept who I was as a person and make me feel different. Okay, so what are the most challenging issues your community faces at the moment? At the moment, the most difficult issues that our community deals with are health insurance policies that are not inclusive of gender transitional medical costs. Many of the insurance companies are calling them elective procedures when in fact that's not true. They are medically necessary and deemed as such um, by WPATH, the World Professional Association of Transgender Health, the AMA, the American Medical Association, all recognize the medical necessity. Currently, there are 4 states in the country that have followed a 2009 mandate, which mandates insurance companies to cover transitional costs, such as gender reassignment surgery, or now what's known as genital confirmation surgery. Um, for the trans guys, it would be top surgery, meaning to remove the breasts and sculpt the chest to represent the male upper body. Those are all deemed medical necessity. Hormone use. I've been taking estrogen injections since 1992. The trans guys take testosterone injections, and they help to change the secondary sex characteristics within the body. The other thing is discrimination. While I live in a relatively progressive area of the country, there are several parts of the country that are not so progressive, and every year we hear of people that are losing their jobs, families throwing them out of the house, and worse, violence and even murder. So, there's been for a number of years a law on a federal level that we're trying to get passed called ENDA, Employment Non-Discrimination Act, which would prohibit the discrimination against people for sexual orientation and gender identity. So obviously that is something that's very important to myself and my community and the larger sub-community, the LGBTQI. Yes, lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, queer, questioning, and intersex. Yeah, it's a hell of an acronym, huh? Anyway, that's my community. So it's all good. So those are the 2 things, and actually my study found the same thing, that those were the barriers to well-being. Specifically, with the elders I was dealing with, what I found most troubling is when their fear of having to go into a nursing facility or some sort of long-term care setting where the people may not be so culturally competent with transgender, and many of my participants expressed a desire to die with dignity, if you will. I guess you might refer to it as euthanasia. I call it dying with dignity. One of my participants' quotes was when I asked her about her long-term plans when she became dependent upon others for care was, and I quote, "a bottle of pills, a good bottle of wine, nice music, and a hot tub," end quote. So you don't have to be a rocket scientist to figure out what she was talking about. But clearly she wanted to not live the excruciating discomfort and shame of being put into a nursing home and being misgendered and maybe even neglected. And that was a high percentage of my participants. My study, by the way, was 42 transgender people, or people that identified as transgender, had transitioned to their core gender, meaning their authentic gender, and were 55 years or older. What I've found really surprising is the average age of transition in my older community, and I am almost 60, so I fit within that category, was 62 was the average age of transition, which meant that people lived for 6 decades in excruciating discomfort, high depression. Several people talked about attempted suicide or suicidal ideation. It's not a good way of living. So that's that. What advice do you have for new social workers as they start their careers? I would say to really take the time and try and understand the diversity of human experience. And one of the classes I teach in Stony Brook is advanced macro social work, and one of the classes specifically I do is on emotional intelligence, meaning to be aware of your own biases and to recognize and be able to read and understand other people. if you're working with the transgender community, hold on, I have a book here. If you're interested in working with the community, this is considered the Bible of working with the transgender community. It's called Transgender Emergence, written by Ari Ishtar Lev. It was written in 2004. It is still very, very relevant. And it talks about transition being an emergence process, which is actually what I found as well in my study, because the reality is that in the community, okay, shall we say, we need to recognize that there are many variants to gender identity and how people sort of feel they identify. So, as a clinician, if you're beginning to work with the community, you need to understand the various terminology. F to M is female to male, male to female is M to F. There's genderqueer, people that don't buy into the whole gender binary whatsoever. And understand that there's fluidity to it. Now, I do understand, and I speak to a lot of my students who have some pretty strong religious beliefs, and I totally respect their religious beliefs. But part of our duty as a good clinical social worker, whether it's working on an individual level or on a macro level, is to respect other people's sense of who they are and not impose our own values or goals, norms, I should say, on them. So that would be my best advice. When working with a client, try and ask them if they're identifying as trans. Chances are, by the time you talk to them, they've already identified as trans. Ask them what pronouns they prefer. Try to use the proper pronouns. Our files at my clinical office have preferred name, preferred pronouns, and we're very respectful of those. The only time we need, obviously, the legal information is, for insurance billing and those types of purposes. Okay, so let's see. At what age did you discover you should be a female, and what were your indicators? Well, I think that, like most of my study participants, 3, 4, 5 years old, it's sort of an innate sense of self. I knew inside. I was very close with my sister. Used to play Barbie dolls, things like that. Once I got to school, I recognized that I wasn't like all the other boys, and that there were certain things that were expected of me. I was very fortunate to live in a supportive environment, a non-judgmental, very progressive home. My parents are both very progressive people, and did not forbid me for playing with dolls or anything like that. Which actually, I'm going to sort of jump to, and I'll come back. One of the questions was nature versus nurture. And, there's a lot of critique on that, and there's a lot of banter back and forth. I strongly believe in the nature over nurture, but let me explain. There's some work coming out of the Netherlands where most of this research is really going on, and what they found, preliminarily anyway, is an extended link in the chromosome, within the DNA, I should say, that seems to set up a blockage of the recepting of the natal hormone. So if you have an XY chromosome fetus in the end of the first trimester of the development of the fetus, the mother who has both estrogen and testosterone in her, the testosterone technically should take over and develop the brain to be male. This receptor interference would say that then the XY chromosome fetus would actually respond to the estrogen and not the testosterone, developing more female brain in a biological male body. My natal sex being male, my brain was still female. Now, as far as nurture, the only aspect I think that sort of comes into play here is the environment itself, like how progressive. For instance, I had a friend of mine who came out I should say, grew up in a very homophobic environment. So just coming out as... So the next question is, at what age did you discover you were female, and what were the indicators? Like most of my participants, basically, we 3, 4, 5 years old, you kind of have an innate sense of self. I had a sister. We used to play dolls and dress up together. At the same token, I didn't think there was anything wrong. Obviously, once I got in school, it was a little bit different. And I recognized that there were certain things that were expected of boys, and because that's what people identified me as, I tried to be. Um, so I guess I kind of always knew. I tried to hide it, like most of my participants. We sort of, look around and observe other males and, if we're trans women, and notice how we're supposed to act and behave and not act to send off wrong signals. But actually, going back to nature versus nurture, which is one of the questions later on, I'm sorry, in the list here, I'm going to answer it now. I strongly believe that it's nature over nurture, in that some of the work coming out of the Netherlands with the research is pretty much indicating that there's an extended link in the DNA which seems to set up a blocking of the receptors in the development of the brain in utero. So, what I mean by that is an XY chromosome fetus at the end of the first trimester in pregnancy is when the hormones start to trigger developmental changes physically in the fetus, specifically the brain area at that point. And what this study shows is that these XY chromosome people with this extended sort of DNA strand seem to have a built-in inability, to sort of block the reception of testosterone in the XY chromosome fetus. Therefore, the brain is developing female inside a male biological unit, if you will, or natal sex. As far as nurture, the only thing I think nurture has something to do with it, in the fact that not that it creates the transgender situation, but that it allows for the facilitation of the healthy development. And what I mean by that is that, for instance, a friend of mine who grew up in a very homophobic environment suppressed her feelings for decades and didn't even come out to herself fully until she was like 40 or 50, even though she knew what was going on, was something was different. Whereas I was brought up in a very progressive environment where it really wasn't questioned. There weren't. I don't say it wasn't questioned, but there wasn't any punitive responses when I expressed something. Like playing dolls with my sister, it wasn't frowned upon, or I wasn't yelled at, or something like that. So I think that's the only aspect of nurture that sort of plays into it. So hopefully that answered your question. How long did you get did it take to get the courage up to bring out to your family, and then to actually transition? Well, my family sort of figured it out when my father caught me cross-dressed in a rather tacky negligee. Actually, it was a peignoir. But anyway, that's besides the point. It wasn't talked about. They did ask me if I wanted to talk to someone. I went to a psychologist that supposedly knew, and basically as I explained to him that I was a woman but was attracted to women. I was about age 16 at this point, by the way. Basically, he said, "Oh, you're just a cross-dresser." And I'm like, "No, it's not about the clothing." But, nevertheless, that was where the understanding of transgender was at that point, because this was back in the late 60s. Yeah, so, because I'm up there in age. Anyway, as far as transitioning, as I said, I was about 18 years into... Hold on 1 minute. Sorry about that. It's that midterm election season where every idiot in town seems to want to be on the phone with you. Anyway, so when I came out to my parents to transition, that was, of course, after getting on board with my wife, who, like I said, we went to couples counseling for about a year. I had an 18-year-old son at the time. I came out to him. He was very accepting. Just said that, we're going to still be a family, just a little bit different family, and that's who it is. My parents were pretty accepting. I didn't know how my father would take it. They were divorced at the time, but nevertheless, they took it very well and been very supportive. My mom passed away about a year after I transitioned. But it's very interesting because one of my participants had the same thing happen, and we shared how important it was that when they passed, that they knew our authentic selves and were accepting of who we were. Where a lot of my participants who transitioned after their parents had passed regretted not having that opportunity. So I was very fortunate in that respect. So, like I said, I was about 18 years into my marriage when I transitioned. So that's about when my family found out as well. The one thing about transitioning and coming out as a transgender is you're out. It's it. Hopefully, Jen warned you of my rather sick humor at times. But she will admit, hopefully, that I have toned the language down. I'm usually a little more streetwise at this point. Anyway. Okay, so as a social worker in your community, what are some of the largest issues you see with your clientele? Well, if you're talking about my clinical practice or my macro practice. So I guess clinical practice is probably what you're speaking of. And usually I am very hesitant to label someone with a diagnosis they came in with from another clinician. And what I say by that is that living in the incorrect body and trying to pass as one's natal sex is very, very difficult to do. It's like pretending to be someone else your whole life. The easiest way I can explain it is for you to look in the mirror and in that mirror put up a picture of someone of the opposite gender, and that's what you see. And now, so when you go out into society, you have to get people to recognize that's who you are and validate that, as opposed to actually validating your authentic self. So, when people come in, it's not uncommon for me to see a bipolar disorder. It's not uncommon to see mood disorder, otherwise specified, depression, anxiety, social phobia, which of course are some of the symptoms that come out. But in fact, the reality is it's the pressure of living inauthentically often that causes it. So generally, what I see, not always, but generally, someone who has finally come out as transgender and transitioned to their core gender and getting acceptance from family, it's amazing how many of those previous diagnoses sort of disappear. Anyway, let's see. So basically, I'm working with the type of anxiety and stuff. As far as, the other issue is that, post-transition, people worry about passing or being, read, as we say in the community, meaning that, people don't see us as our authentic gender. Well, really, the basis of that need to pass as your, core gender really is almost an internalized transphobia. And I'm not saying that I walk around with a big T on my chest, but at the same token, all my students know, I tell them first day, I'm a 59-year-old transgender woman, married to a woman for 37 years. I consider myself a lesbian. I have flat shoes and drive a pickup truck. I'm about as stereotypical as you can get. But that's where that stands. As far as oppression, the only oppression, I've never lived in anywhere like the Texas Panhandle, which I guess evidently is sort of identified as one of the more conservative parts of your state, unlike Austin, which I hear is awesome. Anyway, I guess the reality is that, when I transitioned, I was a mortgage banker, which is a very conservative field. and I was probably one of the top producers. Yet I hit a glass ceiling about 90 miles an hour. And I don't mean it wasn't strictly the sexism, it was transgenderism, it was whatever. I was not cisgendered and therefore dis, sort of discounted my abilities and talents. So don't get me wrong, I made a very good income in there, but for as far as progressing into, up the sort of say the corporate ladder was not going to happen. Um, okay, so Jen said that you, I guess, mentioned that my study with transgender elderly and the aging population, what discriminations do transgender elders face. Well, I talked a little bit before about the fear of, some of the nursing home facilities, assisted living, those types of things. I think some of the other issues we deal with is there's a lack of research as to what happens over time with the hormones. What we're using hormones off-label use. They weren't designed to change one's gender. They work very effectively at it. I think a C cup with no implant, so I'm quite happy. But there isn't really a lot of research as far as that's concerned and what that does. Most of my participants said the same thing. They all felt about 15 younger than their chronologically aged male friends, shall we say. Maybe it's the estrogen being the fountain of youth, if you will. I like to think so. Anyway, but it was interesting some of the different types of oppression that they have experienced. One woman who was a lawyer with a six-figure income went down to about $5,000 a year after transitioning. She called, searching for employment. Now, this is a person with a doctorate in law and, many years of practice. And she calls it the triple whammy. Transphobia, sexism, and ageism. So all these things put together makes it kind of tough. I would say approximately a third of my participants are unable to retire as they had planned due to, as I said before, the medical expenses that weren't covered by medical insurance. I myself was fortunate because I was working in a very lucrative field when I transitioned. I spent approximately $87,000 on transition. That would be between the various surgeries, if you will, and hormones and uncovered other sorts of treatments. I went through 300 hours of electrolysis at $60 an hour. My gender confirmation surgery was about $30,000. I did some facial work for another $20,000, and I probably had about 7 years of therapy that wasn't covered because I saw a specialist who did not accept insurance, and I was not going to submit based on transgender because I knew it was an exclusionary clause. So I would say about $87,000. I spent the trans guys; it's much higher. As I said, hopefully we're working towards a point where insurance companies will start to cover it. What are some of the largest obstacles you've had to overcome? Well, obviously family for one. Getting them to, my goal in my transition was to maintain the family unit and to not, wind up divorced and alone. Everyone fears getting older and being alone, especially considering she was my soulmate and still is my soulmate, luckily. But that was my biggest fear. I guess as far as, the other issue, which is pretty predominant and with me as well, is even though I was in a higher income, I did have to liquidate IRAs to pay for my transition, which were basically originally designed to be my retirement. So here I am at 60 years old with a clinical practice and working towards a PhD to hopefully become faculty full-time someday. And I probably will work till I'm 90 or 6 feet under, whichever comes first. Matters not to me. Not that I'm suicidal, don't get me wrong. Okay? um, okay, so let's see. Does my wife now consider herself a lesbian since you have transitioned to female? My wife does not. She recognizes that people probably see her as a lesbian. We have a lot of friends we hang out with that are lesbians. However, she loves me, her husband, whoever that she may, whoever she may be, is exactly what she says. So I would say, even though she doesn't use the phrase, pansexuality is probably the closest to what she identifies, meaning that she loves the person. It's not about the gender identity. Um, do I ever regret the decision to transition? Not one goddamn minute. No, I don't regret it at all. It was the thing that saved my life. When I made the decision to actually progress, I was sitting on the side of the expressway, the LIE, and Jen can explain that little parking lot to you, with a suicide note and a gun. I was that clinically depressed and suicidal, and it was just too uncomfortable to live. And at that point, I was 32 years old, and had the bright idea that, like, well, let's try this transition thing, because worst comes to worst, I can always do this later. So I do not regret it one minute. It was quite a bit. It was quite a journey, obviously, but I don't regret it at all. How difficult was it to transition in the work environment and with your family? Well, they screwed up a lot with pronouns. But other than that, no, they were pretty accepting. I had worked with the same group of people for quite some time. I guess let me have some caveat to that. Actually, my wife and I at the time both worked in the banking business for the same institution in different locations. So both locations were very progressive. When I went on board with that one company, I told them before I went to work for them that I was transgender and would be on hormones and living my life as female for a year prior to transitioning medically and surgically. And they looked at me, the board of directors, and said, "Are we going to make money?" And I said, "Yes." "I don't care what you do in your private time." So it was really never an issue for me in work. Other than that glass ceiling I had, as I said. What challenges do you face as a clinical social worker outside of your community? I guess I'm a little bit unsure what the question is, because there's another question later on that asks me, do I identify trans to my clients? Well, the reality is that some of my clients know and some don't, and I don't bring it up. I don't deny it if they acknowledge it, because I'm not hiding who I am. But in most cases, it's not clinically relevant. I have, several elder clients, because I do like working with the elderly, and one gentleman who's 83, working with him on a complicated morning. He's lost his wife of 52 years 3 years ago, and he's still suffering with some chronic bereavement, which under the new DSM-5 is considered sort of a disruptive depression due to reoccurring bereavement. Anyway, that's in the DSM-5. I can only remember one particular incident where it became an issue, where I was working with a couple of young children doing some sand tray therapy, and the parents evidently found out I was transgender and basically immediately withdrew them, and then called my clinical director and said we should have known. And luckily my clinical director, Dr. Friedman, said, "I don't really see how it's clinically relevant." So she stood by me. So other than that, As a social worker, I guess the biggest challenge that we face is sort of the evolving practice, and I say that in a positive state. I think that the practice is becoming much more professional than it was. It's not the old days of how should we say, down with the man type thing. We are with the new DSM-5 and soon to be the DSM 5.1 with the clinical measurements of severity. We will have documentation to support the diagnosis. And also, several states, I don't know about Texas, but New York just recently changed some of the licensing requirements saying that we have to maintain or continuing education units, 36 units every 3 years, which I think is like long, long overdue. There's too many clinicians out there that are sort of subjectively throwing diagnosis around, and it's kind of a problem. Obviously, dealing with insurance companies is not the easiest thing. My practice is set up where we actually have someone who does all the billing, and she's there. And no, Jen, it's not Marge, who's phenomenal. She gets every penny for us that we can. I do have several clients I see pro bono. Um, I have worked with a lot of trans youth that have been thrown out of their house. I'm getting them on Medicaid and subsidized housing to sort of get them stable and then going into working with them. I do take Medicaid in my private practice as long as it's an HMO. And they actually pay pretty well, so it's all good. Do you find that the non-LGBT clients treat you any differently once they become aware? Well, I think I kind of addressed that before. The clients who have been accepting have just like, it's like not an issue. Obviously, a large portion of my clients are trans, or at least the family of trans. I do a lot of work in the community because I do love to do it, but that's the reality. What made you want to change genders? I could have had a V8. No, like I said, it's it goes back to that old what I said before or earlier in this presentation was the fact that the reality is that we start out trying to pretend to be someone else that we're not in order to sort of please others, or as I coded in my research, obligation to others and passing as one natal sex. We use the word transition in the community and around, but I make the clarification in my dissertation that emergence is actually a better term for it. In the fact that we were always that core gender, we've just finally emerged and actually allowed everyone to see our authentic self. I think it's those around us that are actually doing the transition. It's not us. We're just emerging and actually allowing you. We're allowing ourselves to become vulnerable so that you can actually see who we are and acknowledge that. So I don't think it's wanting to change. The precipitating events that came up in my study were awareness of mortality or fading life reserve. The ending of obligations to others. In other words, finally the kids are out of the house. It's not time for me. And the biggest one, which I used in my group and I also heard through my research, was when the pain to remain outweighs the pain to change, you transition. In other words, it's just too painful to go on living a lie. Imagine yourself trying to be someone you're not your whole life. It's very tough. I spoke to the nature versus nurture. Okay. Do your clients all know you are transgender? Not all of them. Like I said, I have a few that don't know, but again, I don't hide it. But I don't. It's not something I put in the room if it's not pertinent to the client. This goes to the same notion of the use of disclosure in clinical practice. I know that in clinical practice they talk about making sure that anything is disclosed is basically in the interest of the client, not in the clinician, and you don't want to sort of break that sort of therapeutic relationship. I do come out to all my transgender clients because I think it actually helps to engage, because all of a sudden they understand. I know what it feels like. I've been there. I've lived it. I know the pitfalls. I know this. I know the system. I know I have all the connections with the endocrinologists. I know how to do the name change over here. Everything basically is set up. So I do come out to those folks. I think I spoke about to the cost of surgery. My family has not oppressed me. As a matter of fact, quite to the opposite. What does your son think of your transition? When I told my son that we may lose some friends over my transition, he said to me, if you lose a friend over something like that, they weren't very good friends to begin with. So he introduces us, I should say, his mother and myself, as his parental units. Those of you that remember Saturday Night Live don't know what I'm talking about. Anyway, do your professors know? And if so, how do they react? Well, I'm working in the school of social work. I've been doing presentations at Stony Brook since 1999. Yeah, I think they pretty much know. That's actually how I got into the school, because I was doing the community organizing and working as a macro social worker prior to actually having the actual technical knowledge. So I haven't had any issues at all. My students think it's great. I don't have any. I've actually had some dialogue with some who actually do have some pretty strong religious beliefs, but they still respect me as a person, possibly because I grade them, but that's all right. But I don't let them. It's a totally open environment in my classrooms. If your viewpoints don't line up with mine, that's fine. Let's have a dialogue. I mean, that's what social work is about. It's about people understanding other people, and I would be remiss if I didn't say that when I do a training or walk into a room, not everyone's going to get it. I understand that, but if a couple of them get it, it's worth it. That's the way I look at it. Do you currently experience any discrimination? No. I guess basically that's the answer. I have not, no. How many transgender people are there actually? Well, that's a very conflicting sort of number that's thrown about. There's been some statistical analysis that say, depending on the definition, if you use a really broad definition of transgender, because it is an umbrella term including like cross-dressers and things like that the numbers could be as high as 1 in 500. I think if you're talking about transsexuals or people that actually transition, whether it's medically or just socially, because some people choose to transition without having surgeries. If the surgery isn't that important to you, don't have the surgery. There's two aspects of transition. There's a social transition and there's a medical transition. And not everything has to be, it doesn't have to go hand in hand. It's not like the old days. Okay. What are the ways that I, as a social worker, can support transgender community? The way you can do it. It's interesting. What I tell people if they're doing some kind of practice work is to put up some kind of safe space sticker so people know that it's LGBT friendly. Be respectful of pronouns. If you have the availability to have a gender neutral bathroom, that's the best. And just be respected. We're human beings, we're not its, we're not things, we're not deviates, we're not like the old, I think it was 1980s movie, Dressed to Kill. I'm not a psychotic transsexual psychiatrist killing my patients. Okay, luckily we've come a long way from that. Okay. So I guess as far as that, just being supportive and listening to your clients and respecting their identity. And understand their identity could be fluid during your work with them. I mean, they could initially come in, like I have clients come in who identify as male to female but are still using the female name. When I ask them if they have a preferred name, they say no. I said, okay, fine. But you tell me when you'd like to change that. Because this is about the client, it's not about me. So, and I'm pretty good with that. Matter of fact, I usually remember their preferred names rather than their legal names, which drives my builder crazy, but nevertheless. What area does your community need the most advocacy? Anti-discrimination laws and The health insurance companies, Medicare has recently lifted the ban on sexual reassignment surgery, so um, I don't know if you're aware of this, but most of the time the insurance companies kind of take their cue from Medicare, so hopefully that will change as well. Um, what? Oh, did your wife, or both seek professional therapy during transition? Yes, as I said before, my wife and I both went through. I was going through working with a therapist, and also my wife and I saw a couples counselor and did some work as well, as far as coming together on that. How did you come out to your wife and child? Well, my wife kind of had an idea. You see, on our first date, it was Halloween. Go figure. I wasn't wearing a, Luke Skywalker outfit. Okay, it was a very detailed costume. Actually, because of where the knowledge of transgender was at the time, I had sort of adopted the categorization of transvestite at the time because that was the correct term if you weren't going to transition. And I told my wife that prior to our getting married, and she thought it was something different. I said, "What do you think it is?" She said, "Well, that means you used to be a woman." I said, "No, it means that I always wanted to be, but I probably won't do anything about it. I love you, and let's go on." Um, so that's where we started. So when it came down to actually transitioning, that was a different story. That was a very tough conversation because obviously I was turning their lives upside down. I did everything I could do financially to set it up so that she wouldn't have to stay with me. We had joint bank accounts. I was totally willing to support two households and whatever it took, if that's what she wanted. Obviously, I didn't want that to happen, but if that's what she wanted. And my son, as I said, I took him out to breakfast and told him, and he was totally fine. What was the process of transition like for you? The process of transition for me was like taking a 10,000-pound weight off my shoulders. Um, just letting the secret out, even before transitioning, was a huge relief, and presenting authentically was phenomenal. Scary, but phenomenal. And to finally get validation of my authentic self was a huge benefit. A huge benefit. Well, I hope I've answered most of the questions. I guess if there's anything else, Jen or Dr. Wood could send me an email. I'll be happy to do a follow up or just jot down some answers and run them off to you quick. So hopefully it's been helpful, and enjoy your class. Jen's awesome. One of my close friends, and we had a lot of good times working for the agency that we work for, even though it was kind of oppressive, the situation. We made the best of it with our picking up our Dunkin' Donut coffee on the way to the team meetings. Remember that, Jen? Okay. Hang in there, guys. Good luck, and create change. Our society needs it.